Hi everyone, so group 3 here. This is macroeconomics, and today we're going to talk a little bit about economic growth. So we're going to start with a small reflection from John Dewey, a great American philosopher who worked up to the mid-1900s and defined growth as the cumulative but directionless process through which humanity develops. So for Dewey, growth is the objective of all natural life. And although at first glance the idea can seem pretty relevant to the topic, going for this specific definition of growth actually allows us to emphasize two of the main characteristics of economic growth. First, by arguing that it's cumulative, meaning that it increases exponentially, and secondly, by establishing it as an end in itself, which I think we'll all agree is the vision most economies embrace. To do that, we're gonna divide our presentation into 5 parts. So first, we're gonna talk about how GDP correlates with other well-being indicators. Then we're gonna discuss the power of GDP growth, powers that can drive economic growth, a country comparison, and finally a quick word about convergence. So over the last few decades, GDP has been at the heart of a lot of criticism, many arguing that it did not account for crucial elements of human welfare and therefore should not be considered as the sole and unique indicator upon which one should forge his opinion within a country, about how well people are doing within a country, more exactly. So therefore, many economists try to come up with new indicators to supposedly demonstrate that development should not be evaluated only through the lens of economic advances, but also through more concrete improvements in overall well-being. So we're gonna take a look at a couple of these here. So first one I think you're all familiar with, HDI, introduced in the 1990s, and it is computed by taking into account measurements of income per capita, life expectancy, and average years of education. So I think there is no further need to elaborate here on the graph. The numbers speak for themselves, and we can see the striking positive correlation between the two variables. There are also some other indicators such as Social Progress Index, or SPI, introduced in 2007, and these totally disregard GDP from their measurements, preferring to compute measures from a staggering number of 52 indicators of well-being. And yet, even these, they don't manage to avoid the very strong correlation with GDP. So GDP per capita is as well highly correlated with other crucial and more objective indicators such as child mortality, rate of poverty, or life expectancy. So I think we can stop here and safely conclude by establishing GDP as an excellent and reliable measure and predictor also of life satisfaction. But still, we should acknowledge, of course, that GDP per capita is not a flawless measure by any means, since it can hide substantial problems such as inequalities within a country, and it doesn't take into account other crucial factors such as the quality of healthcare or environmental issues or public safety matters.
I'm going to explain the power of the GDP growth. Today, after the 2018 crisis, the GDP has been growing slower. Many say that this slowdown is due to the decrease of innovation. We are not creative anymore, we run out of ideas. This is also due to the fact that the mentality of people becomes more conservative. As families tend to save more, consumption is drastically affected, and therefore the unemployment rate rises, because the level of consumption changes and GDP grows more slowly. It is important to know that small changes in the GDP imply big differences in the level of the GDP per capita in the long run. To calculate the growth, we use the exponential growth, that it is a process by which a quantity, like the GDP per capita, grows as a constant portion or growth rate. It results because new growth builds or past growth and its effect compound. This implies that modest differences in growth rate translate into large differences in the level of a quantity after many years growing. Another form is using the GDP growth rate, that is the change in a quantity between two dates, relative to the beginning date. First, to calculate it, you have to choose two periods of time, t and t plus 1, and denote the GDP per capita in those days as y. For example, how do you calculate the GDP growth rate between 2016 and 2017 in Spain? You have to use the GDP of 2017 minus the GDP of 2016 and divided it by the GDP of 2016. To sum up, in general, the countries that grow the most will have a higher GDP and GDP per capita, like Japan in the following table.
I will be now talking about factors that drive an economy growth. First of all, there are two types of growth, the sustained growth and the catch-up growth. Sustained growth is the growth process in which the GDP per capita increase at a steady and positive growth. Countries like United States, United Kingdom, and France have a sustained growth. Catch-up growth instead is the growth process in which countries that are economically behind, in order to increase their income, take advantage of advanced countries' knowledge and inventions. Countries like Hong Kong or Chile have a catch-up growth. But what is the problem? Well, most of these countries nowadays have reached a sustained growth, so it is tricky for them now to continue copying advanced countries. So which factors drive economic growth? So the production function is given by multiplying A, technology, by the physical capital K and the labor L. In order to increase the output, so the GDP, countries can either improve technology or increase the stock of physical capital and labor. So the question is, can countries grow forever? Well, countries will not be able to increase forever capital and labor. For instance, they will not be able to always build new streets and new airport. Why? Because of the law of diminishing marginal product. As we can see in this graph, there is a positive relationship between K, the physical capital stock, and the output, such as the diminishing marginal product. We can see that if we increase capital, the output will increase. However, the marginal contribution of an additional unit of capital to output eventually decreases. So to sum up, this law shows how, by increasing capital and labor, eventually this will lead to a smaller and smaller increase of the output. So in order to answer to the question, can economies grow forever? This all depends on the technological progress. If technology is improved, this will lead to a shift up of the production function. And what will happen? Well, the output per worker will increase by keeping the same amount of capital per worker. But all of this focus on technology has led to this creativity destruction. All of this competition has pushed companies to improve constantly technologies and inventions. And this has led to a destruction of previous inventions. So nowadays people are worried. They are worried because of our society that is more and more automized. There's more inventions, technologies, and robots, and they're scared that eventually their the workforce will be substituted by robots.
So the GDP that we use to compare between two countries is the real GDP adjusted by the PPP, which actually refers to the purchasing power parity. So it is important to correct nominal GDP for changes in prices over time, also by the purchasing power of people in different countries. Also, the PPP constructs the cost of a representative bundle of commodities in each country and adjusts the GDP so that a dollar in each country can purchase this representative bundle. The convergence refers to how poorer economies grow domestic product per capita will tend to grow at faster rates than economies with an actual higher gross domestic product per capita. And to the question if there is convergence among countries, there is actually no clear pattern, as we can observe in the graph in the previous slide, which refers to the growth rate of GDP per person since 1960 versus GDP per person in 1960 as well. Also, which economies should be recommended to boost their economic growth? Well, there are a couple of factors that drive economic growth, but not in the short run, but actually in the long run. Those factors are the physical capital, which are policies that support physical infrastructures and equipment, the human capital, which are the policies that support improvements in the quality of education, and finally the technology factors, which refers to the improvements in the actual productivity of people. All this topic is, we related all this topic to the current COVID-19 crisis that we are suffering globally, and it is impacting Spain and many other countries in the European Union. So this article talks how Spain is going to will receive the 140 billion over the next 6 years from a new coronavirus recovery that the 27 members of the European Union agreed on in the early hours of this Tuesday. The amount allocated to Spain is the equivalent of 11.2% of the country's gross national product in 2019, and it actually makes Spain the second biggest victim of this COVID-19 crisis after Italy.
In conclusion, we know that the GDP per capita is highly correlated with other indicators of well-being. In addition, also the cross-country differences in GDP per capita partly result from differences in physical capital per worker and the human capital of workers, but differences in technology and efficiency of production are even more important. Finally, when comparing the GDP per capita of different countries, we need to correct for variations in exchange rates and systematic differences in prices across countries. And therefore, when comparing the standard of living across countries, we use the purchasing power parity.